As mentioned, I'm Pierre Tardieu, working for the European Wind Energy Organization, and what I'd like to do now is steer a little bit away from the discussion on support schemes and on the cost of wind energy, and turn the argument on its head. Over the past years, the industry has made, I think, a pretty good case of demonstrating our ability to fight against climate change, to contribute to security in terms of energy, etc. But increasingly now, in a time of economic downturn, people are coming to us and saying, well, you need to realize that actually renewables are quite costly. What do you have to say in your defense? I think it's really critical now, and I'm going to explain in more detail the conclusions of our Green Growth Report, to have pretty strong stark figures demonstrating the ability of the industry to contribute to actually the European economy. So this is what I'm going to do in the next couple of slides. Now, just a few words on my organization. As I mentioned, EWEA represents now 700 members from 60 countries. We cover the entire supply chain, coming from turbine manufacturers to part suppliers, electricity providers, utilities, national associations, etc. Our activities cover obviously doing some lobbying, communication, research on the latest developments of the industry, as well as coordinating European-funded projects and organizing the premier wind energy event in Europe. These are some of our lead sponsors. You will be familiar with these names. I'm just going to take also a moment to plug the next event of EWEA, which will take place in Vienna on February of next year. I mentioned this because this will be particularly focused on Central and Eastern European emerging markets. Now, if you have an interest, obviously, in the promotion of a market such as Romania, and I think there are a lot of things to be said for investing in Romania, your contribution will be highly appreciated at this conference and exhibition. Now, looking at the presentation as such, what we're going to do is we're going to spend a couple of slides looking at the situation in terms of installed capacity at the moment. Then we're going to look forward, have projections for 2020 and 2030, and then we will break down the impact on the European economy today. Once we've done that, looked at the direct impact, employment, taxes, exports and imports, etc. We'll do projections again for 2020 and 2030, which we hope can shed light on some of the political decisions to be made today that will shape the future of the industry in the years to come. Okay, so this is basically the installed capacity that we have in the industry today. So at the end of 2010, we reached 84 gigawatt of installed capacity. This should reach 230 gigawatts in 2020 and 400 in 2030. With a significant contribution of over 150 gigawatt coming from offshore. So this is the figures in terms of terawatt hours. So you see that it should reach 580 terawatt hour in 2020 and more than 1,100 in 2030. Now this is the contribution in terms of direct contribution to the GDP. Now we've run three different models: one based on added value, one on expenditure, and one on actually costs. And we came up with the same figures, basing it basically on installed capacity, on the cost of building wind energy projects, taxes paid, exports minus imports, and compensation for the workers. What we found is that running these three models, the direct contribution of companies working in the wind energy sector amounted to roughly 17 billion euros in 2010. If we sum up the figures for the 4 years, for past years, which we examined as part of this report, this amounted to 60 billion euros for the European economy. Now, this is breaking down actually the proportion of the contribution as compared to the European economy as a whole. What this demonstrates is because this figure is increasing over time, actually the sector is growing much faster than the European economy. Of course, we well know that 2009 was a peak year, with especially an exceptional year for Spain. So it should come to no surprise that in that year the sector grew much faster than the economy as a whole, especially because this was a year of economic downturn. But even in 2010, where we saw much slower growth for the sector, this was actually twice as fast for the growth as the economy as a whole. Now, this is a breakdown for different subsectors. So you see here, obviously, the developers at the top, and turbine manufacturers, service providers, and parts suppliers. And this is another way to look roughly at the same thing. You see that the different subsectors are actually quite balanced, and there's a relative stability with a positive trend for the developers as the quantity of installations grow over the years, as does the revenue generated from the sale of electricity. So the contribution of developers increases slightly over time. Now, in order to evaluate this, specifically the contribution to the economy of the developers, we had to do a complex exercise and go through the assessment of an average electricity price coming from wind power. And it turns out, we thought that this was an interesting finding. It's not something that we had foreseen originally, but it turns out that this average power price is relatively stable coming from wind. Seeing this, we thought it would be quite interesting to compare it to other energy sources. And so we looked at fuel, fuel oil, gas, and coal, and this is the picture that we got. While the price is very stable for wind power, for other energy sources, we have really a roller coaster ride. So this is a pretty telling picture of a true asset of investing in wind power. Having this lack of volatility really gives you a lot of stability in terms of return on investment, and it's an asset that really should be kept in mind at the time of investing in wind power. Now, focusing on the trade aspect. As you well know, European companies are global leaders. This is true of turbine manufacturers, and it's also true of developers. Turbine manufacturers, I think still for now, 4 of the top 10 global leaders are European. And you see here that imports and exports over the 4-year period have grown, which is logical because the sector as a whole has grown. What's important to note here is that we have a pretty large trade surplus, and that this surplus increases as well. So in 2009 and 2010, the difference between export and imports was actually plus 5 billion euros both years. Turbine manufacturers have a great part to play in this, especially in terms of exports, and they make a very significant contribution to that very positive trade surplus. Now, this is, I think this is probably one of the critical points. If we're trying to make the case for wind, people oftentimes say, well, the fight against climate change, energy security, this is rather abstract. But what is investing in wind doing for my community? And this is a pretty clear figure in terms of direct employment. We found, with a modeling run by Deloitte, that actually 135,000 jobs have been created as a result of the activities of the wind energy sector. Now, in terms of taxes, if we're going to have a discussion on cost, and in order to rebut the story according to which the sector is getting a free ride on public subsidies, we need to remind them constantly that actually the companies that are in the sector are normal companies, and they're actually contributing to the state budget just like anybody else. Putting a figure on this, in 2010, corporate taxes in Europe as a whole for the sector amounted to roughly 2 billion euros. If we add actually the taxes paid by the workers in the wind industry, this almost doubles and reaches 3.5 billion euros for 2010. Now, in terms of overall economic impact, so far we've looked at the direct impact in terms of employment, direct contribution to the GDP, etc. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the impact from the associated sectors, and we'll break this down in just a moment. What's important to keep in mind is that whereas the direct contribution to the GDP of the sector was 17 billion euros in 2010. If we take the indirect impact as well, this actually amounts to 32 billion euros. And if we look at the share of the GDP, you can see the figures here, and it's much more significant at about a quarter of a point for 2010 in terms of GDP. Now again, this is the overall contribution to the GDP, and the share of the GDP as compared to other sectors in the European economy. So we've done this to give, because obviously all these figures are kind of abstract, to give a point of comparison. So obviously the wind energy sector is dwarfed by huge sectors such as construction and automotive for the time being, but is relatively comparable to the footwear industry for now. And obviously in decades to come we hope to be moving up that ladder. Now, overall economic impact, we discussed this, and this is the contribution to employment. The figure that we had before actually running this model with Deloitte was actually more conservative than what we see here. We evaluated the overall employment, direct and indirect, to be about 189,000. It actually turned out that with this modeling, we compiled 238,000 jobs. And again, you see here the dramatic impact of factoring indirect sectors in this tally. Now, what are these indirect sectors that are benefiting from investments in the wind industry? Here you have a breakdown of 12 identified sectors which benefit. Each time €1 is invested in the wind energy sector, these different subsectors benefit and generate. For example, if we look at metals, generate 15 cents per €1 invested in the wind sector. Obviously construction, obviously transport benefit from this, and you see them near the top. But you have 12 different sectors going all the way down to chemicals, a European powerhouse, which gets 2 cents for every single euro invested in the European wind industry. Now, research and development. One thing I didn't mention about jobs in the previous slide is that the sort of employment that are being provided by the industry are high-quality employment, highly skilled jobs, and generally generating revenue for the people, which is much higher than the average salaries. One of the reasons for that is that the industry is quite innovative, and this is also one of the backbones of the success story of the industry in Europe. If we compare the research and development expenditure for the European sector, our own figures for the growth of the European industry. So while we are at 32 billion euros of contribution to the GDP, this should reach more than 170 billion in 2030. Now, looking at the contribution to the EU GDP in terms of percentage, as I mentioned, we are at roughly 1/4 of a point in 2010. This should reach practically 1 full point of EU GDP between 2030. Keeping in mind that we expect the EU GDP to grow, this means an even higher growth rate for the sector. This is roughly comparing where the industry will be in 2020 and 2030 as compared to the size of the different European economies. So in 2020, the European sector will be roughly the size of the 18th European economy, and we expect this to move up 1 slot in 2030 and to reach the 18th rank if we were to compare it with the sizes of the different European economies. So actually, the wind sector would generate just about as much revenue as the Romanian economy as a whole in 2030. So just under that. Of course, if the Romanian wind energy sector does particularly well, this will benefit the Romanian economy as a whole. And finally, a last point on employment. As I mentioned, I've given the picture of what's happening today, and we've tried to give some projections about the impact on the GDP. In terms of employment, I expect with the economic downturn this to remain front and center in the minds and hearts of politicians. Now I think here we have a pretty compelling story. From 230